All right, so this is Todd Atkins. I'm back from the Philippines, and I'm here with Miguel who's in Costa Rica as always. And this is MMA Conspiracy Hour. And before we start, I want people to check out Live to Fight Design. You can find them on Instagram at Live to Fight Design. They make fight banners and gym banners. And if you use my promo code Todd Atkins, you can get $20 off your order. Now, today, we're going to talk about the UFC or the fighter antitrust lawsuit that has just been certified to go forward. So this has been a recent announcement within the last few days. So Miguel, first I wanted to ask you kind of what your initial thoughts were on it finally getting certified.
This high level type of legal battle is about like drawing lines in the sand. And this is one that the UFC has certainly defended this line. And that is, it's not certified yet. We don't want it to be certified. Whatever our lawyers can do to put a damper on that, it can't go further without that. So they drew that line and they've been defending that line for a long time. So now a line of defense has failed because the courts have decided that there is material enough here to go forward and unite the fighters under the construct of the lawsuit. So we'll see what happens now. But I think that the UFC, by vehemently defending at that point, let you know that they're going to defend this all the way through to the end. And probably it is because they're going to be found guilty. And that's just an assumption on my part. But as an observer who's watched them operate from the beginning to the end, that ruthless nature, comes with, like a deeper end. And a lot of the things that they did are questionable in terms of under the monopoly laws and that type of stuff that they're going to come up against here, because they did crush the competition one way or another. And what they did is they did that on multiple fronts, not just the promoters, but they crushed, guys making T-shirts in their backyard or, in their garage, little companies, if you didn't work with them, eventually you just weren't going to be able to continue in the business. And, so I think that this whole setup of the business is been set up by them, kind of like on almost like as a mafia blueprint, where it's like they do what they want, they grab a bite of everything. Everything. The sponsor, remember the sponsors when fighters used to walk out with a mishmash of stuff and oh, it doesn't look good, and that's the excuse they use. But all of a sudden, they make a big corporate deal, and every fighter's got a uniform. And if you remember the fighters around that time, I'm not sure how the things look in the landscape now. I'm sure everybody's prices have gone up. But when they did it, the fighters were definitely against it. And it took money out of their pocket and put it into Dana's pocket. That's just one example that was very visible. That played out before our eyes, and nobody says nothing. So, because that's the way sports are,
I want to ask you a couple of things. The first thing is, and you may not be able to answer this, but how much longer do you think the UFC could keep this tied up?
Well, probably years. Probably years still. I mean, I don't know. You're right. I'm not really qualified to say that, but at this point, they've kept it tied up for 10 years. It could be tied up for that amount of time. As the lawyers exchange information and you start to reveal things.
Okay, so Miguel, one thing I want to ask you is you kind of said that they probably know they're going to be found guilty, the UFC in this case. I wanted to ask you, Endeavor, they buy the UFC. I'm sure a company of that size, a conglomerate of that size, that has since then gone on to buy WWE, that they've looked heavily into this. They're going to be the ones that ultimately make a payout if there's going to be one, which if they lost, there would be. How much do you think they thought this would come? this, possibility would come. Do you think Endeavor purchased the UFC knowing that this could be a possibility, or did they think it was going to go away? Or, I mean, I know there's no way you could know that, you weren't there when they made that decision, but just looking at it.
Well, the lawsuit existed when they bought it. So if they weren't aware of it, then, something in the matrix is broken, right? So they knew about it. I'm sure the Fertitas and Dana presented it with their typical arrogance of, there's nothing behind that. And when, they're now a public company and, like it or not, a lot of the books and things have to be public and you got to be real forthcoming. In other words, for a private company to go public, there's usually a bunch of cleanup that has to happen. So I think Dana and the Fertitas were in some stage of that process, cleaning up, making sure, that the skeletons get buried or whatever. And they presented it possibly in a light fashion. If Endeavor are sharp lawyers, it's up to you to decide. If Endeavor are sharp lawyers, a lawyer may have sent up a warning flag there and said, this lawsuit, if it goes through, the potential is damage. So they may have heard, up to that level that it's a potentially damaging lawsuit if it goes to, the full course, but that they were battling hard to not have that happen, and they've battled hard, just as hard since. So Endeavor didn't want that to happen either. I think that's just a playbook on these things, But I do wonder, now that they've gotten a dose of Dana working with him, and you can see that Dana, it's not like Dana came around and now gives a shit about things, He still very clearly doesn't give a shit and does whatever he wants. Is there a feeling that, these people, they're being accused of, unfair business practices, and it does seem like personality-wise, they're capable of this. I don't know. Once you get around Dana and you start seeing how he operates on a daily basis with some of this stuff, he's got, a media personality, so, he's got defenders and things like that. But if you look at the ruthlessness from the very beginning in a business where there was a lot of, grassroots kind of camaraderie, to a certain extent. Regional systems, it's almost like when the pro wrestling system went from regional to being run by the WWE, and that kind of nostalgic look at the way, I don't want to be looking at it like nostalgia, but there were a lot of grassroots businesses that died when the UFC failed to embrace them, or actively sought to knock them out.
Now, let me ask you, like, with this going through, with it looking likely that they would be found guilty, with Endeavor coming in late in the game, something you just mentioned where you're talking about they're looking at Dana White, they've had kind of a feel, they probably know that Endeavor, that is, probably knows that he's someone who would act in this kind of a way at this point, seeing how he manages things from day to day. Would it benefit from them to make a change away from him as far as the lawsuit goes, or would it not even matter?
We've had this conversation before, and I speak without any inside knowledge, but I'm really confident that there was a contract that executed Dana's transition from the Fertitas to the new company. And, especially, it was right around then that Joe Silva left, right? So Silva took the money and ran. So without that, you've just, Joe kind of wasn't a Danish. Everybody else there was on Dana's team. So I would not be surprised, and I still stand by this, that Dana's transition contract gave him extreme power. Can't be dismissed. Can't be, until he's ready to go. When he wants to go, he makes the shots. Nobody can. He's irreplaceable. And I think that's, to some extent, why you see him act with impunity in certain situations. Because I don't think Endeavor can just say, Dana, you're fired. When he
Right,
hit
but
his
with
wife,
this
that would
case
have been the
coming
time to
up,
do it.
he might be more. I'm asking, do you think he might be more willing to step away for their benefit if it would help the UFC?
No, I don't think Dana, especially in his old age, is showing more and more that he's about Dana. Enough of the rhetoric of like he loves the sport and stuff like that. He's as jaded as they come now. Seeing thousands of fights, no fight impresses him anymore the same way. He's kind of going through his act is like McGregor's. It's just not fresh anymore. And he looks bored. He looks like he wants to be doing other things. But this is what makes him $500 million, made him $500 million. So, and that's the other part of it is, if his personal wealth is correct there, then, there's something broken in this, in a structure where none, you can add up most of the fighter wealth. And aside from McGregor, I don't think you get anywhere near, what Dana's amassed, and that could be that's a high level look at that, but that may be indicative of what you're going to find there. It was a situation where it didn't matter who or what was making money; they were targeted, and a portion of that money was going to go to the machine. That's the way it worked. Like I said, you saw that with the sponsors, you saw that with the manager. It was the Monty Cox story is a very fascinating story because Monty at one point, a mover and a shaker in the early days, managed to be the manager of record for 4 of the 5 UFC champions at one time. And obviously that made him a pretty powerful person. But Monty, used that in a reasonable sense, negotiate an extra $5,000 here, or, you take care of me on the next show, or, even joking around and stuff like that. But Monty, never actively worked and, shut down a UFC show over pay and held all the fight. I got 6 of the 8 guys on the card. On your main card is all my guys. We'll all walk and ruin your show. That wasn't the kind of atmosphere. That type of atmosphere was brought in by Dana and for the Fertittas, that cutthroat atmosphere. And they went after Monty because Monty had too much power, even though Monty didn't use that power in the way that they were afraid to. But if Dana was in that situation, he knows what he would do. So that's what made him very afraid. And then they got Monty's management. At some point, he had to get fighters, and he did. He hustled. He got fighters fights overseas, et cetera, and stuff like that. But at some point, if you're on a long-term run with the UFC, you're going to make more money there than in most places anyway, in the fight game, because they're at the top of the pyramid. So how much of Monty's income did they actually affect by, executing, the system which they have now, where it's like there's management companies that are related to the UFC or, loosely related to the UFC. And if you're not with one of them, you're unlikely to get a chance in the UFC. But independent management is just no longer exists. They took that out. And again, when I talk about going through emails and texts and things like that, years worth, this is the kind of stuff that you will definitely be able to prove there, because people are very uncareful, and at some point you become very complacent in that nobody's stopping you. So even though at some point they may not have looked at it like breaking the law, but it seems it seems that there was a lot of negative and work to actively shut down competition in many ways. With the managers, they started to institute the bonuses. Again, and here's a false way where, like, if they're making $1 billion, giving a $50,000 bonus or three of them out per show, big deal. That's the problem. But if you're the fighter who gets it, you're happy. Then the other fighters sort of start going for it, and there's competition there, and nobody talks about the fact that if they just had 50,000 that they could just hand out, and hey, look, they're 4 great fights, so they give out another 50. Is there that big a budget? Because I know when we ran a show, it's like I didn't have bonus money at the end. I could just 6 great fights. I'm going to bonus them all. But the UFC had that kind of pool already. Nobody questioned that. Why isn't that being spread out in higher fighter pay across the board rather than giving it out in bonuses? It came with the ulterior motive of telling the fighters the bonus isn't in your contract. Don't give your manager a percentage of the bonus. And a lot of them said, oh, 75 grand. I got to give my manager, $15,000 for doing nothing. If your agreement said that your manager earns 20% of all your fight income, then absolutely you do. So they started little wars between management and their fighters so that they could institute a management structure now, where you've got sub companies that, and they did the same with the sponsors. And again, how much of the money is the corporation grabbing from the Venom deal? The Reebok deal went south fast because, Reebok may be too big a corporation in that this was small for them, and they got botched it, and it didn't go well, and then they never sunk the money in to really repair it. But whatever they were giving to the fighters there, Dana said, we're not taking any of the money, we're giving it all to the fighters. Yeah. He didn't say that with Venom. So how much money did Venom come up with to make the deal happen? So there's a lot over time. There's a lot of situations where the UFC always opted to X out competition and be very aggressive. And that consistent pattern, I think, is what leads me to believe that this lawsuit, well executed, could have some teeth.
I'm going to touch on something you just mentioned. This is kind of off the topic a little bit, but you just brought it up. That's why I'm going to mention this, because I was thinking about this. You brought up the fact that, like, Monty was getting 20% of all earnings. And a lot of managers today, I think they get like 10%, even if the fighter gets a bonus. And I saw like Josh Thompson and Sean O'Malley and others saying that the manager shouldn't get any of a performance bonus. And what I'm going to defend managers here a little bit. Most of them, their fighters are getting less than what the performance bonus is. Unless they have a fighter that's a champion or a high contender, most of their fighters are getting less than what the performance bonus is. What are you expecting managers to get paid from? They're not like, in high level sports, NBA, NFL, MLB, they're getting large commissions of huge contracts. MMA managers aren't getting that. Those contracts aren't out there. So
I understand that.
That's just something I wanted to touch on with you.
Because the structure is different, how does it work out? Because if you get a fighter a 5-fight deal, escalating money, you did your job. You literally for 4 fights, you do nothing except for become a secretary and exchange paperwork. Right. And that's part of what it is secretarial duties and, wake the fighter up. Hey, you overslept. You got your press conference, be on top of things if your fighter needs that sort of stuff. But then once the pay goes up, fighters start looking at all the things the manager does like that, and it starts to not be worth it at a certain percentage. It comes down to this. It's very simple. Sean O'Malley, Josh Thompson, if they signed a deal with a manager and the deal said 20% of all fighter-related earnings, then you got to give it up. If you were savvy enough to catch that line and change it, then you don't have to give it up. It's that simple. But it's on paper. And that's what made Monty, comfortable with that. There are fighters that left Monty for that. that they
Right.
just would not play. There are fighters that relish giving it to Monty because just Monty dealt with a lot of loose change and stuff on a fighter's end, fan mail and crap. I mean, Monty was pretty multifaceted. So some people were okay with the service. Hey, I made 50 grand, I give him 10, I still got 40. Yeah, it's not that simple, but what did Monty do in the ring to make that 10? Nothing. But Monty's performance came when he issued the language on the contract. And a lot at some point, if you go back further enough in Monty's history, Monty was on handshake deals with people. But again, when a fighter goes from making $2,000 for a fight in the UFC, like a Laverne Clark level guy under Monty, and then all of a sudden, he takes a big jump, he's going to want to know, hey, I thought I was making 50. Where's the other 10? So the UFC found a spot where they can, get in there. And at the end of the day, it seems like their minions are the ones that are grabbing the extra money, and it's not going to the fighters. So, again, more power to the lawsuit. I hope it plays out and we get to find out whether these things are, just figments of my imagination or if actually some of these practices were in place.
Now, let me ask you this. Let's say they do lose. And, if they were to lose, obviously Endeavor's going to have to make a big payout. But not just that. They're going to have to change some of their practices. They're going to be forced to do so. And if you go off of Dana's wording, his messaging, he's shown no indication that he's interested in doing any of that. So if they were to lose, how do you think they go forward?
Yeah, if he loses in court, whether Dana's interested or not has nothing to do with it. He will have to do that if he's going to continue in the role. And then I don't know, they'll get a period of time or whatever. And I'm sure Dana is old enough and has enough money at this point that he'll probably just leave. And, he'll get to keep most of his money, right? I don't think the payout will be like, Dana, you got to chip in here. I don't think that's the way that works. So he's going to ride off into the sunset rich. His ego will take a bump. And that's the one thing that I think his resistance and just being bullheaded now in the media is, it's all ego. Because, he's had his way, really, with the business for, 20 years, 20
Then he
some
can
years.
focus on Power Slap, right?
Yeah, that's the kind of thing where it's like you begin to question a lot of stuff. It's like that to me, where's the pay-per-view? Where's the event in Abu Dhabi? Where's all the crap he talked about, bringing guys from Russia for the second season and stuff like that? There doesn't seem to be a lot of active follow-up. If that's being developed, they're not doing it publicly or doing it with publicity. So he's slowly sinking into him that didn't work. That's a loss. And he hasn't taken many losses like that on the business and public. So
that's a good point you just brought up. He didn't deliver on some of the things he said he was going to deliver on with Power Slap.
Yeah, and to me it's a dead issue. He can keep saying, again, I saw an interview with him saying, they were at a bar or something, and people's reaction to it was just like unbelievable. And I think he actually mentioned at some point that in one of the casinos, the like all the old NBA heads, like the basketball heads, were like over there watching this stuff. We've been subject to a season of this. Todd, you mildly followed it. I ask you again, name one Power Slap. You remember the Jesus guy, right? There's a guy with her, but so yeah, this is a failure. And he was bullheaded at the end, saying, "No, we're going to push through season 2 and stuff like that." But it seems to have really quieted down, And yeah, the UFC was his golden moment. If he thought he was going to tap that with Power, so then his judgment's off. He's just simply way off at this point. And more power to him. You know, he could ride off into the sunset with Donald Sterling, go be wacky and old and play with your money wherever you want.
Well, let me ask you this. Could it put UFC out of business? I mean, if they weren't, because like I said, they had Endeavor, if anything, since they've come in, they've cut costs. They haven't increased costs. They, they started the Apex. They're running more shows at the Apex, a lot less shows on the road. They may not want to do any of this stuff. Do you think it's something where it could conceivably put the UFC out of business, that Endeavor just cuts their losses?
Endeavor would probably sell, and whoever they'll buy somebody will buy it, and the name and history will still have some value. Will it be the 15 billion in value it has now? Probably not. But I think that the fighting game that was done. That's ensconced in the modern culture at this point. So I don't think fight game goes away. Maybe the UFC name doesn't operate anymore, and somebody else sort of takes over as the big role. Bellator, PFL, one somebody steps up, but just like when a fighter goes from the big UFC shows to Bellator, or now that they're with WWE, when you go from WrestleMania to wrestling again in a gymnasium in front of 300 people, you're going to feel the difference. And that's what will happen is if Endeavor has to make a massive payout and they cash in whoever owns the name or whatever the new big game in town is you'll feel how much smaller it is than it was before.
Let me ask you this. If Endeavor has to make a huge payout and then sells, would this be looked at as maybe one of the historical bad decisions by a big entity that chose to buy a company like that, knowing that they were facing a potential lawsuit?
No, it was. I don't know where they. We'll see how this lawsuit plays out. Right? Obviously, if it does go away at some point, or the payout is minimal, and they can continue with business as usual, then their risk was okay. But that's what's at play here: is they did the risk they take. Was it worth it? Was it something that now, the risk is really coming into play, and you may not be able to sustain the income. You may not be able to keep the company at the level it's at. You may not be able to keep it growing. Don't get me wrong. The merge with the WWE, that's a big business move. That's a big move, and that's big companies with big power and big drawing power, big name recognition coming together. So they're already operating at different levels. Some of that may come up. Can you imagine if the lawsuit decides that deal to unite them with WWE is null and void?
How could that happen?
I'm making it up. I don't know, but maybe the WWE would want out of it as well, because the WWE in that merge would have had to do the same due diligence as Endeavor, and they probably saw the same things, and they decided to jump in and take the risk.
That is a good point. I mean, if UFC doesn't continue, what's the motivation for WWE to, the whole merger?
To stay with that company, it doesn't. WWE. What's valuable there is the library. So they'll still be able to sell, and it will depend where we will see fights, even though they're history. How many people actually? I'm crazy. I've sat and watched wrestlers from the 50s just to see how they move and things like that. But I don't think a lot of people do. I certainly don't think a lot of people go back. There's some, but I don't think you see too many 22-year-olds being like, "Oh, I really like to see some tape of the '56 Yankees." So that library still has some value. It's massive. And the
Right.
WWE would be all right to control that or shelve it.
But when Endeavor made that purchase, they made that with the intention of merging these two together to make TKO, the ticker symbol, and to combine these two massive juggernauts to go forward. If the UFC gets taken out or severely crippled by this lawsuit, that blows up everything they just did.
Yeah, the lawsuit isn't going to come, and it's still years away from playing itself out. And the thing is you're going to have to execute both of these. Whatever's going on with the WWE and the UFC, they have to continue to merge and grow together. We already saw that Ronda and Shayna, sort of as predicted, are already doing a storyline involving MMA. And you'll see more of them using their powers that way. I'm not a big fan of it, but the more time that goes by and the more they become used to it, they have two creative departments at this point. When that merges to one, it becomes harder to undo the deal or, say, I'm going to cut my losses or whatever. I think the WWE at this point is backing Endeavor and backing everybody, throwing, hey, I got a good lawyer over here. And they're going to fight the crap out of that lawsuit together. That's a lot. To me, the fighters are due a big payout if the lawsuit goes out. And the more money that those companies have, interlaced there, we'll see how much they actually get their hands on. It'd be nice to see it at the end of the day, fighters sort of receiving something at the end, the lawsuit plays out. But I just think that these corporations are going to resist it to the end.
Let me ask you this. Is there a way the UFC could settle and not, because the change of the business practices has to happen as part of this. So they can't really just settle and pay because they still would have to change. The whole point of this lawsuit is they engaged in practices that were unethical.
Legally, if the UFC came to the lawsuit, to the lawyers handling the lawsuit and said, look, this is what we offer. You got 800 fighters now, or however many, we'll use a simple number of 1,000. You got 1,000 fighters. We're going to give, on average, 400,000 to every one of them. And whatever that works out on a calculator, it'll be a lot of money. Some more, some less, depending on, performance in this. But on average, about 400,000 for each fighter. So again, then the lawyers would have to go to the fighters. Some would want to accept, and some won't. And that's where you have to hold the line. If you don't accept the offer, then the UFC is likely to be forced by the courts to change their business practices. If they come forth with a monetary offer that's accepted and it doesn't come with the additional change in structure that the courts might require, then they circumvent what the courts were going to do. And then they could continue practicing exactly the way they have now.
They could really do that?
I don't know legally, but yeah, I think if they settled out of court, then you would have to engage in a whole new process to force them to change their business practices. What repercussion do you have aside from the court decision? And the court decision would be taken away because the two parties settled.
Wow.
And so, yeah, they may be saving their pennies so that they can make that big offer, have the fighters take that money. But again, I think the fighters there are united. I think that there's actually that feeling of like, that they've been disrespected a little bit too. And that lack of respect is what makes you hold the line here. Because if you're going to be given a big payout to keep your mouth shut and then they keep doing what they're doing, who won? There are a lot of personal victories, but the sport didn't win. So I think this is an altruistic lawsuit in that respect. I hope the fighters, aren't faced with that. If they are, I hope they hold the line.
Yeah, I think for the UFC and for an Endeavor, that would be the best outcome for them. Let's settle. And then let's kind of keep operating the way we were operating. Maybe change a little bit, but
hold on a second here. I'm just I'm going to take a minute and let's just, and I'm nowhere near the numbers or anything like that, but let's say there was 1,000 fighters involved in a lawsuit, and the average payout for it to be meaningful, would have to be about 400,000. Just as an imaginary number. So in other words, that's the average. So some guys, a guy who had one fight may get 15,000, 20,000 more.
Mm-hmm.
But guys who had copious, now that right there, so $400,000 for 1,000 fighters comes out to be 400 million, and a company worth 15 billion.
Yeah.
So I think I'm on the low end of what the payout would be. But they would have to have, and they have cash on hand. The fighters would have to say, okay, that's enough money. I don't wish to pursue this lawsuit anymore for the good of the sport. We don't need to get into any of the other stuff. It's actually not a lot of money. I thought it was going to be 4 billion, and then when off the top of my head, and then when 4 billion on a $15 billion company is a big hit, 400 million isn't that much. So they could, if there are 1,000, if there's 3,000 fighters instead of 1,000, you're looking at 1.2 billion. Still not extreme, less than 10%. Yeah. And they've got the cash on hand. So if there are 3,000 fighters, all those fighters in the UFC can get, you just give them 400,000 each. The guys who had 30 fights, like Chris Lytle, probably deserve more. The guys who had 2 fights, like Trevino, the kid who fought Sage Northcutt, he probably don't deserve 400, but he'll take 120. He had 3 fights. If you're going to give, how much value per fight are you going to give to the guy? There are a lot of ways to break it up. Yeah. But the fighter at that point, I don't know. What I don't know is how it would be handled. It's like, look, a certain fighter is due 150 grand, and he wants to take it because his mother and they need the money and this. Meanwhile, another guy is due 2 million, but he's going to sit on it. He'll go all in and he'll wait. Will some fighters be able to get out there? I don't think that's the way that works. I think it's either everybody takes the payout or nobody takes the payout. That's what a settlement would be. So it's a tough spot to be in, to tell another guy who might, so many hundreds, now we bumped it up to 3,000. I don't know exactly how many fighters are in the lawsuit, but it's a pretty decent number. Now you're talking about life stories, somebody in a life and death situation, and you're going to tell them, no, you can't get this money that's due you. It becomes really complicated. Yeah, you may have just unearthed one way the UFC could throw a monkey wrench in this thing, is to make a decent attempt at an offer that shuts this thing down.
Yeah. O'Malley and Aljo, are you going to watch it tonight?
Oh yeah.
How do you think that's going to go?
Yeah, I think Sterling is showing himself. He didn't win the belt in the best way, but I think that since then he's shown me that he's been pretty masterful in terms of his media approach. Even taking this fight, it's like, hey Dana, you didn't even ask me. I need some time off. This, that, the other thing. Don't worry about it. I'll be there. I think he's past the Jan, controversy and victory. I think he put a nail in that coffin with a strong second fight with Jan. I think he's been performing at a high level, since then, and that's on all facets, in the ring and outside the ring. So I think we're about to find out. O'Malley's taking a big jump up. They carried him. He's had some tough fights. Obviously, he fought Jan as well, but yeah, I think O'Malley, we're about to find out if he's the real deal or not.
Yeah, that'll be something interesting to talk about after the fact.
Yeah, for sure.
Now talk a little bit about the dog rescue that you're working on that we talked about last week.
Well, here we are, the Wet Nose Project in Costa Rica, and we are. It's been a tough week. There was a lady that was a hoarding case with like 50 or 60 dogs on her property that her uh, family sued her to get, this taken care of. And it was like, you have 72 hours to get all the dogs out of there or they're going to start shooting them. So, flurry of activity. Now we got some downtime right now. There are a lot of dogs in cages, but they're all out of there. And now the fun begins, start to actually, invest in them and put some work in them. So just a lot of really interesting work. That felt good because it felt like a rescue. I know at some point I'm going to see some things I don't want to ever see. But this was a feel good week for that stuff. A lot of activity. Um, and we'll see how everything goes. There's a GoFundMe out there that Todd's been helping me with. Anything you can give is great. We'll definitely put it to use for the dogs, and I appreciate it. I appreciate it if anyone cares out there.
And how would the contributions, how would they be used as far as maybe talk about some of that?
Well, there are tons of activities, like for example, like rescuing 50, 60 dogs, they needed to come up with cages, transport cages, gasoline. Gasoline's not cheap down here. Probably about $7 or $8 a gallon compared to the States. And it's either that or let them come shoot dogs on Sunday. So it's like you have to have money to operate. Castration campaigns, go find street dogs if they're healthy and they're doing okay. You can't save every dog off the street, but you can make sure that they're not having puppies. Feeding strays is becoming an issue. Times are tough around the world, and you can kind of see that in the abandonment of animals and things like that. In Costa Rica, they have good laws, but not a lot of strong enforcement. And mainly, people drive their dog out. If they're going to abandon it, drive it to the boondocks and just leave it. And so that's where, the per diem expenses of rescue is, add up because it's like, all right, we got to go, 40 kilometers to go look at a dog. You got to get gas, and have some food, have the cage ready, get everything together and go and take action, Then like I said, the castration campaigns, they come with, you got to pay somebody to care for the dog immediately after the operation, at least for days, a couple of days, right? Feeding them is a lot. There's 60 dogs on the Wet Nose Project property already that live there. And, that costs probably about, I don't know. I can't even imagine actually how much it costs to feed 60 dogs on a monthly basis. But that's all done through donations and things like that. And, adoptions are way down all across the world, really. And there seems to be a glut of animals, and the animals are the ones that are suffering. So anyway, yeah, that's the latest update.
And people watching this or listening to it when I put it on audio, I'll have this information in the show notes. Now, talking about the MMA collector, are you doing some new stuff with that, or do you have some new stuff coming up?
I do. We set October as a comeback for the actual collector show, as my partner Ed has seasonal work that he just couldn't beat his schedule during the summer months. So in October we'll pick that up. I decided I'm going to try to get published today. I'm not sure if I'm going to make it, but if I do, on August 20th, I'm going to start a new series, kind of as a tribute to boxing collectors. And it's based on the Illustrated Record, a magazine or a newspaper that covered boxing. I have about a year's worth of them from 1910 and 1911. Tomorrow's August 20th. I have the August 20th, 1910 issue. So I'm just going to break them down and go through the news that's in those magazines and stuff. And this one's a tribute to the death of Joe Gans, one of the greatest lightweight champions and the first black lightweight champion in history. So kind of a historic figure. Just so happens we're going to pick up there, and then we'll see if every week we'll put one out with the new magazine. Just fascinating stuff. I think it goes beyond boxing and beyond fighting history, I think looking at it through the magazines of the Illustrated Record there, especially because it's a news magazine that also has like crime uh, stories and things like that. Um, it's a real little taste of Americana. So I enjoy doing it. I don't care if anybody watches it or not. I enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I think if you had cigar, you kind of have the old school boxing historian look, like Burt Sugar, or
Yeah,
with the hat. you know.
those those are big shoes to fill, but they need to be filled, and I'm willing to try. So I enjoy the boxing stuff, as you can see, my backdrop and stuff like that. We're getting back on our feet in a new spot, so all's good.
All right. Well, Miguel, as always, I appreciate talking to you. It's always great to hear your take on some of these new stories coming out. And for everyone that supports the show, obviously appreciate it. And until next episode, take care and be on the lookout for us again.